Welcome back to the channel, everyone. It's Tyler James Milliken here with another study of the main points of the Bible as we attempt to unpack the main point of the book of 2 John. This is a much neglected epistle. If you haven't turned to 2 John in quite some time, it is one of the few passages in the New Testament that has a specific warning against the Antichrist. So for as much as it has been neglected, this is one of the clearest passages we have about the threat of the Antichrist during the end times. Speaking of the threat of the Antichrist, by the end of today's video, we're going to almost physically fight with Bart Ehrman and his lackeys over their summary of this book of the Bible. But first, we need to get a little bit more context to understand what 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John were doing and what they were actually accomplishing within their historical context. So, to begin with, if you think about John's ministry in Ephesus for most of his life, compared to his writing from Patmos in the book of Revelation, when he sent out the letters to the 7 churches from Patmos, they circulated through Ephesus, around the bend, all the way to Laodicea. And 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John probably had a similar kind of circulation throughout Asia Minor. John was headquartered in Ephesus for most of his life, where 2nd and 3rd John would have been written, and it probably reached a similar audience as the 7 letters found in the book of Revelation. Now, as to their content, what each one of these books is accomplishing is unique, because 1st John is known as a literary homily. It's sort of like a stylized written sermon with exhortations and discipleship lessons, whereas 2nd John functions as the defense letter and 3rd John as a missionary letter, dispatching faithful ministers and missionaries to send out the truth throughout the region. Now, why would such a thing happen? This was all in response to an emerging crisis and apostasy during the late 1st century known as the Antichrist movement. So John is responding to an outbreak of false teachings about the person of Christ especially, and what this means about the message of the gospel and who Christ is in his humanity and his deity. So we have to ask a question. Was John most likely to write 1st John historically first and then send out a defense letter and then finally dispatch some missionaries throughout the region? In other words, was he more likely to craft this detailed kind of stylized sermon? This is very carefully crafted in 1st John, followed by a couple emergency letters. Most likely not. Spoiler alert, the books of the Bible are not actually arranged in a historical timeline order from Matthew to Revelation. Even though Revelation comes last, most of them are not in a timeline order in that kind of sense. Historically, it was more likely that John immediately dispatched a defense letter, that is what we now call 2nd John, in response to the Antichrist apostasy, then launched counter-missionaries for the truth, and then finally had more to write down in the epistle we now know as 1st John. Now, why would we come to that conclusion? Because that's what he says at the end of 2nd and 3rd John. He says he has many more things left to write down, grapho, and his gospel was already written by that time. We could get into the particulars of the dating of the gospel, but today we're looking at 2nd John. So this comes from my commentary work in 2nd and 3rd John, which you cannot get, by the way, even though these are all hyperlinked through Logos, through Lexham Press. You cannot get this commentary at the time of this recording. It's not available yet, but this would be the historical sequence from which these epistles emerged. Stage 1. The apostasy is erupting with false teachers being dispatched all throughout the region. And we're going to get into the historical detail of what they were teaching. But this was a movement of false teachers that were denying core truths about who Jesus is, therefore coming to a different gospel because they were preaching a different Jesus. And so 2nd John functions as the defense letter to stifle the spread of the Antichrist movement. Stage 2. In response to their false teachers, they send out faithful missionary teachers throughout the region for the sake of the truth. This is what 3rd John is all about. And then finally, since, as he said, he had many things left to write down at the end of 2nd and 3rd John, he records those things in 1st John with fuller instructions about discipleship and the truth that the church must preserve. So, turning now to the content of 2nd John, we have a short little epistle here. Both 2nd and 3rd John are around 120 to 150 words in the original Greek text, just over a dozen verses each. And John is writing to a sister church within the region known as idiomatically, the chosen lady and her children. This is a personification for the sister church. And what does he emphasize here? Truth and love throughout the introduction of the epistle. Whom I love in truth, I know them in truth for the sake of the truth which abides in us and will be with us forever. Grace, mercy, and peace from God the Father and from Jesus Christ. This is the person that the false teachers are denying, the Son of the Father, in truth and love. Now, the key part of this introduction is that truth and love must go together. You cannot have love if you're not rooted in the truth, and you cannot obey the truth unless you actually are fueled by love and living in love. So these two things have to go together. In other words, God does not want the church losing their heart for him in terms of losing their first love, nor does he want them losing their minds in terms of leaving the truth, because the Antichrist movement was missing both of these things. And the truth that abides in us is talking about the internal indwelling of God's truth in the message of Christ, and quite probably here a personification of Christ dwelling in us, the hope of glory, the person of Christ actually dwelling in the hearts of the regenerate, saved, redeemed, true church, as Jesus himself said, I am the way and the truth and the life. And of course, one of the key parts of these epistles, we are flowing out of the gospel here. Same writer historically, we can defend that as well. But you cannot have God the Father without the Son, because no one comes to the Father except through him. So John writes because he's rejoicing that some, this is actually implied in the genitive construction in the Greek text, he's rejoicing because some of the children are walking in truth. What's the implication? Some have departed. Some are no longer walking in the truth. That's your Antichrist movement of the apostasy that he has warned against. But he is rejoicing because there's still a remnant of faithful believers that are walking in the truth. They're maintaining the commandments of truth and love that they've heard from the very beginning. And John grounds the call to live in truth and love with the following warnings, which gets us very close to the main point of this book. Why must we live in truth and love together? Because many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh. Now we have a definitional statement about the false teachings of the Antichrist movement. What was the Antichrist movement all about? They were denying something about the person of Christ, who is fully God and fully man. And although in our modern apologetics, we are mainly dealing with people who do not confess the deity of Christ, they do not know him as God, this ancient heresy was actually denying his humanity. This is remarkable. They were claiming he was a spiritual being in their view, a divine being, their God even, some might have said, but they did not believe that he took on flesh and incarnated as a real human being. And John says, if you do not have a human Christ, a human mediator, you are not part of the true church. You are part of what he identifies as the deceiver and the Antichrist. Now notice the shift here from plural to singular. Many deceivers have gone out. This is the false missionary movement from the false church. And collectively, he identifies this movement made up of many false teachers as what he calls the deceiver and the Antichrist, definite article, ha Antichristos. Now, what does this tell us about our doctrine of the end times? If some of you have been waiting for some distant futuristic vision of some sci-fi, Bitcoin, Apache helicopter in Palestine, future Antichrist figure, that's not what John was warning about. He was saying 2,000 years ago, the Antichrist was already operating even at the end of the first century. Through what? Through false teachers. What were they denying? A different Christ and a different gospel was their message, so they were denying the true gospel and the true message of Christ. Now, this brings us to the first command form imperative in the letter, and it does bring us to the main point of this book. So, this commentary work is based on a rhetorical structural outline, calling all nerds. You got to get to the bottom of these kinds of things. So here's the overall logical and rhetorical flow of thought for this epistle. It builds up from the initial introduction in a call to walk in truth and love. And this is rooted in his warning that we must defend against these false teachers in response to false teachers going out and preaching a different Christ and leading people astray from the truth of Christ. The main point comes to a head in verse 8. In response to this, watch out, be on guard for yourselves, so that you do not lose the things that we have worked for, but receive a full reward. The main point of this epistle is a warning for the true church to be on guard and defend against false teachings and distortions of Christ and distortions of the gospel, because some have departed and they have lost what they seemed to have. They have lost the things that they worked for in ministry. Then we get this expanded warning. This is coming out in verse 9. Anyone who goes too far. This is a great rendering of the Greek text for proago. It's talking about crossing the line, crossing a boundary that one ought not to cross. Anyone who goes too far and does not abide or remain in the teaching of Christ. This is didache. This is doctrine. Anyone who does not abide in the doctrine of Christ does not have God. But the one who abides in the doctrine, that is teaching, same word, he has both the Father and the Son. So when these false missionaries come knocking at your door, telling you they've got some kind of good news, but it's a different Jesus and it's a different gospel, he's saying you cannot be sending, receiving, wishing them Godspeed, or blessing their ministry whatsoever. Now, this doesn't mean there's not a place for apologetics at the door. This whole epistle is apologetic, but what it's saying is not receiving them and hosting them. This term for greeting would be, in a sense, wishing them Godspeed and supporting their ministry in some way. And John is saying, if you're supporting false teachers with a different Christ, if he's not fully God and fully man, then you are participant in their evil deeds, and you are guilty, as they are, in their ministry. Now, at the core of this, what we have is a definitional statement about, there's that word again, doctrine. Now, what have you heard? Oh, doctrine this, doctrine that. This is a love church. That's a doctrine church. Doctrine divides is what people put together in that senseless little slogan. How did John begin? He began this epistle by saying, you must have love and you must have truth. Where does truth come from? It comes from sound teaching, sound preaching. It comes from doctrine, which is literally the term for teaching. So for anyone claiming, oh, doctrine divides, are you saying teaching, sound teaching is not a good thing? Were you aware that Jesus taught? This is all about the teaching of Christ, remaining in what he taught and what we teach about him. Jesus taught, and it did divide. It divided light from darkness. It divided truth from falsehood. It divided sheep from goats. It divided 4 different types of soil, because as the truth went out, if it's dividing anything, it's dividing between eternal condemnation and eternal life. And what he's saying is there is a boundary, there is a line, and the dividing line is people that go too far and don't remain in the doctrine. That's what this is about here. So he exhorts us to remain in the teaching of Christ, that he is fully God and fully man. And with that, if we know the true Christ and the true gospel, we will have both the Father and the Son together. Now, turning then, where does this bring us to in our comparison to Bart Ehrman and his lackeys in their summary of this particular book of 2 John? This is what they have to say. 2 John, a short letter warning against deceivers and emphasizing the commandment to love one another. Curious here, he's left out that opening statement that love has to be wedded to what? The truth. What's missing here? The teaching, the doctrine, the faithful doctrine, somehow conveniently left out by Bart Ehrman and his crew over there. Also, nothing about the Antichrist movement, nothing about remaining in the true message of Christ and the true gospel. Curiously, in something that should have warned us against the Antichrist, conveniently, these things have somehow been left out. So how could we then spell out the full main point of this book It comes in verse 8 with that command form. The church must defend against the Antichrist movement and its false teachers, their false message about Jesus, by what? By living in obedience to the truth and living in loving obedience, those are united together, and defending the truth of his deity and humanity. So we have to have all of this together comprehensively to maintain the truth of the gospel and to live in truth and love. So, how would you articulate in your own words the main point of this book now that we've studied through it a little bit? How has this helped to polish up your understanding of 2 John? And stay tuned for our upcoming study of 3 John as well as 1 John. And we'll see you next time in our study of the main points of all the scriptures.